Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I am your host, Gabriel Garcia, otherwise known as the Wandering Quill and the Wandering Scribe. And today, I have a guest that I am super excited to show here on the channel. My guest today is an award-winning fantasy author. He has written two trilogies, The Age of Darkness and The Age of Dread, plus a prequel novella set in the magical infused world of Mordana. He also wrote The Quest for Heroes duology, The Coward and the Warrior. His latest novel, The Judas Blossom, is the first installment in a Persian-inspired historical fantasy trilogy. The Nightingale and the Falcon, the second in the trilogy, The Blood-Dimmed Tide, will be published July 9th of this year by Angry Robot Books, and tell us more about the duology series of The Coward and the Warrior. Let's give a huge round of applause to a first-timer here on the show, Mr. Stephen Aryan. Stephen, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to talking.
Awesome. So before we dive into your books, The Coward and the Warrior, anything more you'd like to tell our audience about your background as a writer and just who you are as a person?
Sure. So I always wanted to be a writer, even from a very early age. It was something that as a child, I think I told my parents and they said, "Oh, that's nice," thinking it was just one of these things like, I'm going to be an astronaut or I'm going to be a fireman. They're like, "Oh yeah, okay, sure. But it was something that I just always wanted to do and kept doing. I wrote my first novel when I was about 19, and It wasn't very good. It wasn't very good at all, obviously, because I didn't have any skills, but I kept writing books, sending them out to agents, which you might come on to, and eventually got picked up by an agent and eventually got a book deal. And then, fast forward 9 years, I'm 10 books down this year. 10 books have been traditionally published. So it's been a long journey, but yeah, now that my foot is in the door, I am not letting it out the door.
That is incredible. Congratulations on that incredible success. And you've already answered like your aha moment of being a writer. But when I would say as a tweak, when it sort of dawned on you, your aha moment was like, oh, I can actually make a career being an author, writing books. When did that come about?
Probably not till much later. As a child, when you're reading books, it never kind of occurs to you that somebody's making money from this and making a living from it. It's not like a job that you think you're going to do. And so it was much later. In my early 20s, I went to lots of conventions in the UK where I live, met other writers, editors, agents. And at that point, it kind of dawned on me that, people do this for work. They do this for a job. Maybe this is something I could do. But by then, I knew how difficult it was to get traditionally published. When I first started looking at it, self-publishing was not what it is today. It didn't really exist back then.
Right.
So it was always going to be traditional publishing or nothing. And so it was towards that period, I realized that, yes, this is something that you can do as a job, but it is a difficult road.
Yes, and that will lead into a series of questions later in the interview when we talk about the business side of being an author. But now let's actually talk about some of your books. And as you mentioned, you've written 10 books thus far, and two of them we'll be discussing, which is The Coward and its follow-up, The Warrior. And yes, viewers, if you can see, they're right also behind Mr. Stephen, which here we have other books. And I just got to tell you, Stephen, when I purchased those books, I did not know what to expect. I went to this blind, and I have to tell you, I have read a lot of fantasy stories, a lot of fiction stories. This is probably my new favorite series of all time because it's not your typical fantasy story of like the hero's quest. And when I was reading the back, I was thinking, wait, was there a prequel to this? Because spoilers for people who haven't read this series, the main character has already established that he was on a previous quest with these group of heroes,
Yeah.
and now he's being called back into service by the king to deal with the threat in the north.
Yes.
And through the whole book, you see that he is a man that's flawed. He's troubled. He's broken because he survived. He got lucky. He was the last one in his party to make it out alive, and everyone wrote stories about him as like the great savior. But reading the book, he's not this great savior. He's just a man who just got lucky, and it really kind of throws the whole hero's quest on its head, that it's not your standard story. And I absolutely love that. And the follow-up to The Warrior, which I greatly love as well. I thought, how is this going to top the first book? And it did. It exceeded my expectations. So for you, Stephen, when you were writing this series, what was the need and desire you wanted to satisfy for your readers, as well as the promise you set out when writing these two books?
So I always have read fantasy, as I said, since a very young age. And so I've read a lot of quest type fantasy novels, and they do follow very familiar patterns. At the same time, I wanted to do a quest novel, but I wanted to reinvent it. I wanted to do something different with this series. And I knew I had to come up with something interesting to make it quite unique and stand out in a very crowded market these days. And so I started thinking about it, and I'd met some people, read some non-fiction books, and met some people who'd basically ended up with PTSD, soldiers, journalists, and other people who've gone through terrible ordeals and have ended up with PTSD and come home and had to kind of try and find a way to rebuild their lives, or just, start a new life. And so those two things kind of came together. And it was the idea of, it's not a spoiler because it is on the back of the book and it's within the first chapter. It's the idea of this guy, when he was 17 years old, the king summoned all the greatest heroes for this quest to the north and said, you've got to go to the north and defeat this thing that we think is up there. And he tagged along as a teenage boy, wanting to be a hero like them, aspiring to them, their wealth, their fame, their fortune. And he thought it would be the best adventure of his life. But actually turned out to be the biggest nightmare of his life, because he watched all of the heroes die in front of him on this quest. He survived mostly through luck, not through skill. And he came home a broken man with PTSD. So as far as everyone else knows, he was victorious. He was the sole survivor. He's the hero. And so propaganda and stories that are expanded on what information he was able to provide is given. And so the legend grows of him. And the reality is something very, very different. And the novel begins 10 years after he's gone on this great quest. He lives a quiet life on a farm. He's still struggling with the effects of his fantastic quest that everybody has. And so I wanted to deal honestly with a hero's journey, what would actually be the repercussions if someone had this terribly disturbing, exciting, but also deeply damaging adventure on an individual. And so I thought that would be an interesting twist to, whilst having some familiar tropes from the kind of hero's quest, but doing something new with it. I won't spoil the rest of the story for anybody who hasn't read it. But with the second book, I knew there again I had to do something very, very different. And so that was a completely kind of reset, but it does follow on from the events of The Coward.
Nice. And so would you say, Stephen, that your series, The Warrior and the Coward, that it's not your standard hero's journey, as almost like your promise to your readers, that don't expect it to be like your typical hero's quest, because as you mentioned just now, there's a lot of trauma that this character experiences. And I'm not going to lie, listeners and viewers, when I read it the first time, I was like, oh, wow, this is a man who has gone through trauma. He has suffered a great deal, and he's angry at the world that has written these fantastic stories about him. And he's like, you don't know the truth. And I love that. Would you say that's almost like one of your main promises to your readers who pick up this series?
Yeah, absolutely. It's the truth of what would happen to an individual, but also if that happened in our world, to someone else, we rewrite history. The victors write the history, but in this case, he didn't want anything to do with it, but the people around him could see how they could use it to their advantage. And so you have a celebrity, in essence, that the people all want to believe in. They use the story as propaganda. It's sung in all the taverns. It inspires people, makes people join up to the army, want to go on quests and heroes, be heroes of themselves, much like he was when he was a boy of 17, of course. And there is a kind of a loop circle in the story. But it's the idea of dealing with a story and a quest on an individual and the impact and how it would be realistic set within the world. And also how other people might benefit it peripherally, which we kind of get into.
Definitely. And so when creating this very, very complex story, which I also have to say, Stephen, I have never read a series that ended in 2 books. I've always read like trilogies and one-off stories. I've never read a series where it just ended in 2 books, and that was really, really incredible. So when crafting this world and writing it out and then publishing it, what were the initial feedback like? What was the response like from the community?
People were quite surprised by it, I think. Some people thought it would be a humorous book because of perhaps of the title, and the back of the book kind of suggests that this guy, is a coward, and they thought it'd be a funny book, but it's not funny. There is dark humor in it where people are dealing with certain things, and there are some amusing moments, but I think it surprised people that it was a lot darker than it was. On the surface, you can just read it as a quest adventure story, but there's a lot more going on beneath it, because it is dealing with trauma, PTSD, fame, celebrity culture, how we put people on pedestals, propaganda, fake news. All of these things are in the background swirling around, that they're there. And so I think when people started scratching beneath the surface, readers who took the time to think about it, they started realizing there's a lot more going on. And equally in the second book, there's lots of things happening there too. So nothing is quite what it appears to be. And I could have just written a straight quest novel that was just a fun adventure, and it's entertaining and distracting. And why not? We all need stories like that. But I wanted to do something more with this. And I think that's probably what surprised some people who came to the book for the first time.
Incredible. And looking back on the success of The Coward and the Warrior, do you feel that your initial promise, your goal that you set out in writing this series, has been validated from the feedback, from the reviews of fans and fellow authors who have picked up your book?
Yes, I got some great praise from fellow authors who gave me cover quotes. But also the best praise I got, I've had emails from readers contacting me, and a couple of people have asked me if I served in the armed forces, because the depiction of PTSD was so realistic. And I said, I have never served, but I take that as a great compliment that I managed to capture it correctly. So feedback from fans and authors has been fantastic.
Incredible. And it's true, listeners. I cannot stress this series enough. It's like one of the best fantasy series I have read, and it took me, I want to say, almost 6 months to read, because I had to reread it again and again, because there's a lot of subplots in there, a lot of hidden stories that are interwoven in the narrative, from, as Mr. Stephen has said, that you have the idea of celebrity status, pop culture icon, news, information, how it can be used by organizations or groups to suit their own benefit. I don't want to give too much spoilers in that, but especially in the first and even in the second book, those elements are prevalent, and it really, really makes you think and really kind of look at the world very differently. And I find that very, very exciting when a book can do that. Not just take you into a fantasy world, but also, I like to call it the 3 E's: educate you, entertain you, and enlighten you. And honestly, Stephen, your series has done that so beautifully. And this, I imagine, comes from like years of experience, like writing, finding your voice, and finding your place in the author community in the sense like, what kind of author do I want to be? So for you, Stephen, as you mentioned before, you've read a lot growing up and even more so now as an author. So what books would you say and what authors that you've researched and looked into really helped you craft your authorial voice and the type of storyteller you want to be for your readers?
So early inspirations were things like Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, David Eddings. Growing up, I read a lot of those books. In my teens, I started reading Terry Brooks. The biggest influence on me is a British fantasy author called David Gemmell, and he writes really lean and punchy novels. They're all quite short, 300-400, 500 would be the biggest book he's ever written. And he was writing morally ambiguous characters put in very difficult situations. Some people would say grimdark now, but I kind of always think that his characters were flawed individuals trying to do the best in a difficult situation. And that really appealed to me. The fact that his prose was very, very tight. But then I grew up reading things like H.P. Lovecraft, Stephen King, Dean Koontz, who's a great thriller writer. And there again, his prose is so sharp and you can fly through books so quickly. And all of these things kind of fed in. And then years later, lots of other kind of other authors like James Barclay and Robin Hobb and so many others have influenced me. But it was that idea of I wanted to tell a story that had quite a fast pace, that still had enough detail that you could feel the world and it felt fleshed out. But I didn't want to languish and have 700, 800, 900 page book where it's one part of 6 in a series or something. When I've written trilogies, I want the book to be about something, even if it's part of a larger story. But the darker side crept in with Lovecraft and Stephen King for sure. It's in some of my books, and great focus on flawed individuals, people like David Gemmell and James Barclay.
Definitely. And this actually relates to another interview I had with another guest who wrote on almost like the psychology of these characters. His book was about an individual who was known as the assassin or the hunter. He is this kind of like gray individual that he is a killer. He's an assassin, but he's not evil. He's not a good assassin. He's sort of like in the middle. And we kind of see through his books like psychology of an individual, like what drives a person like him to do what he do. And I see that in The Coward and the Warrior. Like for all these characters, what motivates them to do what they do? And it's just fascinating. Like the main character is just trouble and just everything. Like really seeing the psychology. Like he feels like a natural person that we would see in our own lives. And I definitely think you would agree, Stephen, that is why people are drawn to this story, is because it's believable. It has elements of our own world, even when it's not trying to be. And that is really, really powerful. So I just want to make that little comment because it's just like, I have never fallen in love with a character or a series of characters until I read your series. So I just wanted to make that little tangent comment.
Thank you. Yeah. The characters in some ways, they're all quite flawed. It's not really a big spoiler, but he assembles a group of people and he goes on a quest. Again, all of the people that he meets are flawed in their own way. They all have various issues that they're either avoiding or they can't deal with or they won't deal with. And so as much as it is Kel's story, it's also them finding a place and a way to go forward. I know there are echoes to the past from himself as a boy in the story with another character. And so it's kind of tying all these things together and trying to put a pin and finish off his story that started 10 years previous when he was a boy. So it's, as you said, there's a surface story, there's a quest adventure, but then there's a lot of other things going on. And that was built in from the beginning.
Definitely. And now focusing on the writing of the story itself, I'm sure you agree, Stephen, that writing any book is definitely a long and tedious project where you spend hours and hours drafting the story and then many more hours editing, revising it, and then wondering is this actually going to be good? Because I'm sure you would definitely agree, Stephen, that among the many things that authors have to face, probably one of the biggest is imposter syndrome, which
Yeah.
is this book going to be good? Am I really going to be doing this? Am I going to put something out there that I've been working on for years? And that can deflate a person's passion to write, even if, they've wanted to write for a very long time and be an author for a very long time. So
Mm.
for you, Stephen, have you ever had those thoughts of imposter syndrome? And as a follow-up to that, if you've had those, what has disciplined you to continue writing, because you know deep down that this is something that you want to do because you are passionate about it?
Writing's the only thing that I really, really enjoy. That's my kind of primary hobby. I have other hobbies, but if I have free time, I will sit down and write for myself first of all. I'm the first reader. I'm not writing for a specific individual. The person I'm writing for is me, because sometimes the stories that I want to read aren't there, so I'm writing them for myself. Imposter syndrome, absolutely. I get in every single book, I have a phase where I'm 30, 40,000 words into it, and I get to that point and I think I don't like this anymore. And it happens with every single book. So I've come to expect it now. But I know it's just part of the process. It's that thing of, how do I do this? Is this any good? Do I know what I'm doing? And you kind of question yourself. But it's getting over that hump, that fear that a lot of people don't do. When people say I want to write a novel, a lot of people do. They have the initial rush and the excitement and the adrenaline of coming up with the ideas, and then they start to work on the book. And then, a few weeks in, it's still exciting, maybe a couple of months, but then they realize they've only written a small portion of the book, and they've got several more months stretching ahead in the
Right.
distance. But meanwhile, in the back of their mind, this other idea has come up, and it's exciting, and you're world building in your mind. You're not actually doing the work, you're just creating it. And so that grass is greener approach can distract people. They go, well, I'm not really enjoying this one anymore. I'll put it down. I'll go and start that other one. That's obviously a much better idea. It isn't. It's just something that's tempting you, because there again, you could get 30, 40, 50,000
Right.
words and then go, oh, this is actually quite difficult. Some people can write books very, very quickly. I'm not one of those people. It takes, the fastest I've ever written a book is 6 months. Normally it's 8, 9, 10 months for a novel. And so it's always a marathon. It's never a sprint for me. The reason and the way I'm able to finish a book is that it's discipline over motivation every single time. I know that some days I don't want to write. Some days I'm not feeling it. I don't wait for the muse, because that's pointless. You'll never finish a book. On the days when I don't want to write, I will still write. I even may think what I've written isn't very good. But once you've gone past that, a few days later, you can come back and look at it. And usually it's not too bad. You can salvage it, you can tweak it, but you still got the words down. You still moved forward on that first draft. And that's what it's all about. You can't go back and edit something if you haven't done it. So you have to keep pushing forward. So it's always discipline over motivation.
I 100% agree, Stephen. It's honestly probably the truest thing for any author, for when it comes to like getting over that hurdle and that stump and everything. And it is true. If you are disciplined, you will get through. And again, if you write something down, may not be what you wanted to write, but you have something there to edit later. It's what I always like to say, which is write drunk, edit sober. It doesn't have to be perfect. Once you have it on the page, you can edit it with a clear mind.
True story. Yep.
Yeah. And now that actually kind of leads into more of now the business side of the interview, which is now the business side of being an author. Now, Stephen, out of all the authors that I've had on the show up to this point, a majority of them have been self-published or indie authors. You, Stephen, are probably now the first traditionally published author I've had on the show. And I'm really eager and really interested to know more about your experiences in the traditionally publishing world when you started with your first book, and how it has evolved over time with your other books that you have written thus far.
Okay, so I was picked up by my literary agent in 2013. I then spent a year working on the book, redrafting it based upon her feedback a couple of times to get it ready for the publisher. And after a year, during this year, she'd been talking to the publishers saying, I've got this book coming up by this author, it's very, very good. Are you interested? And a few were interested. So at the end of that year, she then sent the book out to a publisher. They had a 7-day exclusive, which means they have 7 days to read the book and make an offer. Otherwise,
Mm.
it goes on wide submission. So normally there are, 6, 7, 8, 10 sci-fi and fantasy traditionally published publishers, and you'd send it out on wide submission to all of them. But we gave the exclusive to Orbit for 7 days. They had 7 days to make an offer. They did within that period. So it then didn't go to the other publishers. They made an offer for a trilogy, and I then signed contracts, and then I started editing book 1 whilst writing book 2, and suddenly I've got deadlines for the first time in my life that I have to stick to. I've got kind of annual deadlines. What Orbit do quite often with fantasy authors and sci-fi authors who are debut authors, they give you an accelerated launch window. So if you're traditionally published, usually it takes you have one book coming out, roughly one book a year. That's kind of the average.
Okay.
But with a debut author, if you're brand new in the market, nobody knows who you are, it's quite difficult to get any traction. And the more authors there are, and the more noise and games and comics and everything that's distracting you, it's harder to get noticed. So what they've done is they'll have, for a trilogy, typically, they'll have one book come out every 6 months instead of a year. So after 12 calendar months, my trilogy was complete. So it came out sort of September-ish 2015, then March 2016, and then September 2016. So sort of, very, very quickly. I had longer up front to write the books and edit them, but it was a lot of hard work during that period because I was essentially working on 3 books at the same time. So that was tricky. It was really tricky. A lot of work.
Wow. And that's actually really, really incredible. And thank you for sharing this with us, because I know very little about the traditionally publishing world. I myself am a self-published indie author, and I try to go the self-publishing. Well, I try to go the traditional publishing route initially, but as you just said, it's not easy. It's very, very, very difficult, and there is a lot of merit to traditionally publishing, but it's a business first and foremost.
Yeah.
And in a business, they always want to see, what is this book going to do, in a sense, like who's it going to target? What's the audience? So when you were having those discussions with like your agent and like with the people at the publishing house, did they sort of tell you or ask you what is the audience for your book, and how important is it for any author to really understand who their audience is, if in a sense they're trying to go for a broad audience, trying to get a wider market, or if the case is like they're writing a fantasy novel, crime thriller, fantasy, etc., and they want to narrow in on a specific niche in the reading community. So I wonder if you could provide your own thoughts on that.
Yeah. So when you approach a literary agent to begin with, when you pitch them your novel, first of all, it has to be finished. You can't send them a novel that isn't complete. In your covering letter, or query letter, it's sometimes called, what an agent will ask for is what they called comp titles, comparison titles. So that means it tells them 2 things. It tells them, where your book sits within the genre that you're writing, 2, that you're reading and you understand the genre in which you're working. Because if you don't, how can you possibly understand the business? Because you have to be a business person, whether you're a self-published or indie published. It's required. The difference, I always say, is with traditionally publishing, all the money flows to the author. You never put your hand in your pocket once to pay for anything. With self-publishing, you are the business entrepreneur.
Yes.
You run everything. You pay for everything, but you manage the team. So the money flows out from you to pay for the team. That's the main difference. There are other things like distribution, timing, how quick you can have books come out, and so on. So in that initial phase, you write to the agent and you say, here's my book. It's similar to X and Y. the audience is, it's adult science, it's adult fantasy in my case. It has themes of this and this. It's talking about this kind of thing. It's this kind of a story. So you send that in with a certain number of chapters for them to read. And if the agent is interested, they'll then ask for the full manuscript to read, which is what happened with me. Then, as I said, I worked on a novel until we got it into shape. My agent said, right, now it's ready for us to approach a publisher. She sent it to the editor with information where my agent thought the book would sit in the market, because as good as my knowledge is of working in traditional publishing, she does it every day. Right. Every single day she deals with me and 30 other clients that she has, but then she's also got other clients who are trying, new clients to sign. So she's dealing with publishers every day, so she understands the market way better than I do. So say if I sent her a book that was urban fantasy, and she'd said, actually that's not a good time.
Ooh, apologies, listeners. We seem to have some technical issues.
That's all right.
Okay, you got cut off there. Don't worry, this will make it into the final cut.
That's okay.
Apologies for that, viewers. But as you were saying, Stephen, you were giving an example, like if you wrote a book on an urban fantasy and your agent was saying, this may not be the right category, the right genre, the right story.
Yeah, it could be that the market is very, very busy and very, very crowded with urban fantasy. And because they work in advance, a year or two to get the books out, they could say, actually, the publisher I'm talking to has 6 or 7 other urban fantasy novels they're going to be publishing in the next 2 years. Offering them an 8th one doesn't, they're not going to say this is a good time to do it, because at the end of the day, they are a business. They need to have something that's commercial, which means they can sell it to the market and people will buy it. And they base that upon their day-to-day experience of working within the industry. With indie publishing, it's slightly different. If I wrote a novel that crossed a fantasy novel that crossed a number of different subgenres and took it to my agent, she might say, I like it, but you've made it so specific. The audience for this is much less. So we could take it to the publisher. They may accept it, but if they do, because their perceived audience of who would read it is much narrower, the advance they will give you will be much smaller.
Right.
If I write a mainstream fantasy novel, epic fantasy, like, Brandon Sanderson style novel, that's a broad audience that appeals to, very young readers, right up to kind of mature readers. That's a very broad audience. And I write an 800 page tome and say, it's one of 6, and that'd be right. The audience is massive for this. Potential number of readers is much bigger. So they kind of factor all of these things in. Whereas if you're indie publishing, you do that all up yourself.
Yes.
You don't need to worry about it as much, because you know that the niche you're probably targeting, you will find the readers out there. It may not be as big as you would hope, but also depends on what you're writing. So as you said, I'm traditionally published. I've had 11 novels and a novella on contract with my publisher. However, I'm self-publishing a novella this year for the first time.
Ooh, okay.
One of the reasons is it's a difficult sell. It crosses a number of genres. It is fantasy, but it has other things in it. So when I took it to my agent, she said, this is a weird book. I said, I know. Number 2, it's a novella. There aren't many publishers that will take novellas because of the length. It's not cost effective. It's not worth their time. And I said, I know. So those two things kind of worked against me in some ways, but equally, it's a story that I want to tell. It's a story that I want to put out there. And so I could just sit on it, or I could self-publish it. Now, I know there'll be some overlaps for my existing readers because of the way I tell stories and the characters, but a lot of other things in it are quite new. Some existing readers may go for it, but there'll be a whole segment of readers who've never read anything by me within the indie space and other places that will be like, what's this? This looks a bit different. This looks a bit interesting, because it's not as typical. It's not as mainstream as some of my other books and stories. So I'm going to become a hybrid author from the tail end of this year. lots of
Fascinating.
new things to learn as I go along.
Nice. Incredible. Very, very fascinating. And kind of
Mm.
touching on what you said about readers, when you began this journey of yours, did you have an ideal vision of what you imagined your reader or your audience would be? And has that changed over time in your life as an author?
The audience, my target audience hasn't really changed. I wanted to write adult fantasy novels expressly for adults so that I could include adult content, whether it's language, violence, or whatever it might be. I once had a woman asked me and say, can I give this to my 14-year-old son to read? And I said, no, absolutely not. Not until he's an adult. He said, he's very mature. I said, I know. I said, how about you read it and then you tell me? And she read it and then she emailed me and said, yeah, I'm not going to give this to him. So that's my kind of audience. I know that I want adults who are familiar with the genre because there's lots of things in there for them that they've kind of seen, but I've twisted. But equally, people who are coming to fantasy for the first time, they're the kind of the audience. It hasn't really changed. Every series I do something different because I never want to repeat myself. I'm constantly testing myself on what I do as I hopefully get better with every series. But I'm still targeting adult readers. It's not to say I won't ever write middle grade or children's fiction at some point, but right now that's what I'm focused on.
Nice. And kind of going back to the previous questions, and I think it's really important one to discuss. So either self-published or traditionally published, I think you would probably agree, Steve, or maybe have some thoughts on this when it comes to trends in the book world. Like if there's a movie coming out like about vampires, fantasy, or like crime thriller, a whole bunch of books come about that try to fill into that category or meet that target audience. And I bring this question up because I'm always interested about that phase of writing. And for you, even in your own opinion, do you feel that authors, be it traditionally published or self-published, they should try to write for that upcoming trend or the trend that's happening, or they should just write the book for themselves and not for the reader, in the sense that, yes, you finish your book, but by the time you finish your book, the audience may not be there and you're behind the curve. So you should think of what's the next trend coming out in a few years.
Yes. So I don't think you should ever write for a trend. Don't think you should ever do it. If you're indie self-published, you can, and you can write a book in 3 months and put it out and surf the wave of whatever that thing is, vampires, whatever it might be. You could say, oh, I've seen a few more of those books coming out now. I'm halfway through. I'm going to finish it now and put it out in 2 months. And you can get some success there because someone's finished the vampire book. They want another one and yours is right there and they can read it. So within the indie space, you can do that. But long term, I don't think that's a good move. I think it requires you to move very fast. It requires you to just constantly chase something rather than come up with an idea that you really want to write, something that's burning in the back of your mind that you have to get out, that you need to tell this story. With traditional publishing, they can't chase trends really because of the speed at which they move. Their publishers are normally working 1 to 2 years ahead of time.
Right.
So my book in a current series, the second book is coming out this July 2024. My publisher has already planned out books for next year, for July 2025. They're looking towards the end of the year and the start of 2026. So if I wrote a vampire book now, it wouldn't come out until potentially 2026, by which time they'll say, the trend will be gone. Why would you try and write a book now for us to put it out then? If it's something that's so huge that's going to run and run and run, then publishers may start looking into it. So the current trend at the moment in the fantasy space is romantasy, as they call it.
Yes.
And some of the larger publishers have now set up sub-imprints that focus purely on that. So it's obviously their belief that this trend is going to stick around for a while, for potentially, let's say, 5 years. So if someone writes a book now and hands it in and it comes out in 2026, that's still within the kind of 5-year time frame. It might be it dries up in 5 years. It might be it dries up in 3 years. It might be that it runs for 10 years. We don't know.
Right.
But there again, if you're already writing one of those books and you see one of these kind of, so new trends coming up, and you're thinking, oh, that's perfect. I'm sending my book in now. Agents are asking for these kind of books. Editors are asking. That's perfect. It's great timing. But if you're trying to chase it, I wouldn't do that. It's difficult to anticipate what the next trend is going to be.
Yes.
It's basically impossible to know. That's the $1 million question. If agents knew, if editors know, they would constantly say, right, don't write that, write this, because in 2 years' time, that'll be huge. So nobody knows. The only thing you can do is write the story that you want to write, that you're passionate about. If you're not passionate about any story, any novel that you've done, it will show. Every conversation you have with someone, they'll be able to tell. If you've just written it to chase a trend because you thought it would make you some money and get you some readers, people can tell. So I always go with an original idea that you have to get out there, that you just need to tell for yourself.
That is perfectly and beautifully said. And it kind of leads into the last question of the business side before we get into the final set of questions. And it's probably one of my new favorite questions to ask. So I'm going to give a little context for this question before I ask you, Stephen. So a while ago, well, a year ago, to be more specific, I had a guest on my show, another author, self-published, and we were talking about her book, Season of the Dragon by Natalie Wright. And she explained to me that that was her 7th book. When I met her, I was under the impression that this was her 1st book. And she said, no, this is my 7th book. And when we talked, she gave me a pearl of wisdom, which I have now considered, and it is very, very true, and a hard pill to swallow. And that is the biggest lie an author could believe is that their debut book is going to be the start of their legacy. Now, in some chances, whether you go traditionally publishing or self-published route, there's a 50-50 chance that that could work, that your book's going to skyrocket. It's going to be huge. It's going to be the New York Times bestseller. It's going to be talked about throughout the world. But on the off chance, your debut book may not get the hype that it receives or that you expected it to receive. But she said that should not deter anyone from writing. You should continue writing. Even if it takes you 7 books, and that book is what truly gets your name out to the public and the start of your legacy, you can tell your readers, this is my growth. So overall, Stephen, my question to you is, how important is it, in your opinion, that any author, self-published or traditionally published, should understand that there is no guarantee that your debut book is going to be the start of your legacy as an author, but it should not deter you from writing if you are passionate about telling stories?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And another way to look at it is you can't expect to be the best at something the first time out the gate. Everything is training. Whether you're a physical athlete, you don't do a bunch of training, run the 100 meters and expect to break the records the first time. There's a small chance you will, maybe,
right?
But it might be that you won't. And so that people train and train and train for years and years and years. And with novels, it's a case of your first book may come out and it may be a great success. Then your second novel might be terrible. For whatever reason, it doesn't work. It might be that you were surfing a wave that seemed to be doing well, but when your book came out, it didn't click with the audience. There's no way to anticipate it or predict it. So what the other author said is absolutely right. I write these stories because I want to tell them, because I have to get them out of my head, and I need to tell these stories and put them out there in the world. So there's a chance that it may be successful. It might not be. There's another author, traditionally published author called Delilah S. Dawson, and she's been on the New York Times bestseller list. She's done all of this, but equally, that doesn't mean she lives in a mansion in Malibu and just drives around on a speedboat all day.
Right.
She had to write the next book and the next book and the next book, and you build up a legacy through a body of work. There are some authors historically that we know who wrote 1 or 2 novels that changed their entire lives and that we still talk about and that were taught in schools. To Kill a Mockingbird. And it wasn't until 40 years later, 50 years later, that a second book came out. There are, Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and The Silmarillion. You know, the
Right.
actual body of work that Tolkien produced is very, very small. But then you think about the really big household names authors like Stephen King and someone like that. Everyone talks about him being a huge success and all the rest of it. He wrote, I think Carrie was his 13th novel that he'd written, that originally was put in a bin, that someone took out the bin and read and said it was good. He was rejected countless times, but equally, he's kept writing and writing and writing. Now he has, 50 novels or something. Looking back, people will pick their own favorite from the body of work from Stephen King.
Right.
So, your current favorite of mine is The Coward. It might be that in 20 years' time, you find another book in my catalogue and think, actually, I like this one more now, but I have to get there. I have to keep writing. The goal is not to get rich. The goal is to have enough money to write full time so that you can spend more time telling the stories that you want. That's my goal, really.
And that is beautifully said. And that is ultimately what I love asking this question, because it is very, very true. There's like almost like the myth, like the bravado, the glamour of, writing full time and like living off the success of the royalties or like everything. But you got to put in the work. You got to put in the work to go through this. And another add on to this is that I had another guest I was speaking about this on, which is if you want to become an author, you have to see down the road or see an author that you admire, see their life work, see where they went through, and really consider if this is what you want to do. Because being an author is like having a job. It is a job. You're spending hours on end. You clock out when you want to. You may have a schedule that you have to finish or you have to meet. And if you can say accurately and truthfully that this is what you want to do with everything, the benefits and the disadvantages, then you will definitely be fine. But if it's not, and you just want to ride the benefits, then that is not for you, and you will not be writing truthfully and accurately, because it will show in your work and the readers will see that. And it's 100% true, which leads into kind of like the last few questions of this interview, Stephen. So looking back at your life right now, up to this point, who have been your biggest supporters on this journey of yours? And have you ever gotten a sense of validation from other authors in the fantasy world? And I ask this because for any business, for any field, it's one thing to join and to be a part of it and to show your knowledge over years of training, and then you develop your own experience. It's another thing entirely to have your peers recognize your work and to see it and to commend you on your achievements.
Yeah, I have had great feedback from readers, but equally from people, authors that I admire and that I respect have given me great feedback as well. When you're traditionally published novels, what often happens is you'll send, or the publisher will send your book out early to a number of authors within the same space to see if they'll read it and give you a cover quote. And that's kind of the highest form of praise you can get, is that someone will read your book, like it enough to have their name on the cover, essentially, with you. And my hero growing up and still to this day is David Gemmell, as I said, but sadly he's passed away. So by the time I debuted, he'd already died. But another hero of mine is James Barclay. And I asked him, I sent him a very early copy of The Coward and said, would he read it? And he said, I'll try, but he's got a busy life. He has a family, he has a job, and he was moving house. And he said, I'll try and fit it in. I thought, okay, I'm not gonna, hold my breath. He's got lots on, but he did read it. And once he sat down, he couldn't put it down. He just kept reading and reading and reading it.
Wow.
And he read it and finished it really quickly and emailed me back and sent me some great positive feedback and great quotes, which have been on the cover of the book. And he absolutely loved it. And basically that's the highest kind of praise that, I'll take. I mean, it got great reviews from sort of trade press, and it got a publisher's starred review for The Coward. But I think James's comments meant more to me as someone I respect, who's been a traditionally published author for, decades at this point.
Nice. That is incredible. And I'm so glad you've had that experience, and to like, it really does build up one's confidence when like a person you admired sees your work and gives you feedback, whether it be like positive or negative or just like hard critiques. It is still an incredible feeling when they've seen it and they've enjoyed it. So I'm very happy that that happened for you, Stephen. And sort of like the second to last question of this interview, which is, looking back, have you ever thought about, in your own private thoughts, how different your life would be if you were not an author?
Yeah, I don't know what I would be doing right now. I'd still be writing stories, I think. If I'd never got published, I'd still just be... So it took me a long time to find a literary agent. It took me over 10 years.
Wow.
Of writing novels, getting rejected by every agent, starting a new novel, writing it, trying again, getting rejected. So, over and over again. I'd write the novel, my friends and family would read it, would give me feedback, I'd edit it and send it out. So when you said earlier, who supported me, my friends and family absolutely have throughout this whole process. And as I've started going to conventions and meeting other authors who, like me, were coming up through the ranks, were trying to get a literary agent at that time, I met a lot of them and they've given me great support. And so I gradually built up a community of people around me, and I've helped them along the way. And some of my friends have now become published authors as well. But it took me a lot of time and a lot of trial and effort and a lot of practice and kind of trying to get it right before I got the agent. So I still think I'd be writing novels and writing stories. And probably at this stage, I would just be an indie published author, I think. I just want to put them out there and see what happens if I hadn't been picked up by an agent.
Wow. And I'm actually glad you brought up the community, because the authors community and the reading community is like a very tight-knit, and I completely agree. I've learned a lot from the people that I've met, and they've really given me some tips, because I'm still learning. I'm still trying to build up, what kind of author I want to be, how I want to approach my books, how I want to approach storytelling. And all these pearls of wisdom are really beneficial, and I try to combine them together with my own knowledge of what I think I want to be as a writer. And which leads into the last question of the interview, Stephen. So with everything that you've learned from your fellow authors, from working in this industry, with everything you've learned, what is your word of wisdom to fellow authors who want to try their hand in this industry?
Okay. I would say you need to set realistic goals. Think about what you actually want to achieve and why you're writing that particular story, and then what you want to do with it. If all you want to do is write the story and then put it out there and see what happens, have a go, and maybe you'll get some readers, maybe you'll get some great feedback. But whether you're just doing that or you want it to be a career path for you, go in and being realistic with the fact that knowing they're only the tip of the spear in the traditional publishing space in every genre are the people who are writing full time, and there are great successes. There are hundreds and thousands of other authors who have full-time or part-time jobs. Same within the indie space. There are a number of people who are extremely successful within every genre, who do phenomenally well and make a good living from it. But if you go down the indie route, you must understand that you're required to produce work regularly, and you have to maintain whatever kind of schedule that you set. So understand the genre that you're writing in, read as much of it as you can, borrow the books from the library, audio books, however you can consume them. Try and attend as many events as you can within your local area or online these days. A lot of conventions have online tickets where you can watch the panels, even ask questions through, chat boxes and things, and understand the space that you're going to be working in. Understand who your contemporaries are within the genre that you're working in, and even with the subgenre, so that you know what the trends are that are at the moment that are going on, so that you know who the agents are and the agencies even if you're going down the traditional route. So you have to do your homework. You have to do your research for whichever path you choose, and understand the biggest thing, which I said, is either if you have the money and the time, you can be an indie published author and manage the team and pay for it all. If you don't have the finances to do that, you can go down the traditionally published route. It does take longer. It does take longer for a book to come out, but you never pay for anything. All the money comes to you, and from the money that comes to you, your agent takes a percentage. Obviously, the publisher takes a percentage, but you still get money for writing that book, as opposed to with the indie thing where you pay for everything, you have to recoup the costs, and everything else on top of that is profit. It's not too different, but it's just who's starting with the money, depending which way you're going to go.
That is probably one of the most original answers I've gotten on this question, which is a perfect way to end this incredible, amazing interview. So, listeners, I hope you've enjoyed this fantastic interview. I want to give a huge thank you to our guest, Mr. Stephen Aryan, for joining us today. Stephen, thank you so much for joining us. And where can people find and engage with you to learn more about your previous works and, as you mentioned before, your upcoming work this July?
Yeah, so my website is a good place to start. I have a monthly newsletter where I send out updates on everything that I'm working on. I'm on Instagram, I'm on Twitter. I also have a YouTube channel where I do writing advice videos. I also interview other authors, self-published and traditionally published, because every person's story to publication is different. And so I like finding out about them, like you do, how they got to where they are, what approach they took. And I do like Q&As on there as well. So if you have questions about publishing or writing or agents or anything, you can post them on there, and I'll do videos in the future answering any questions that you can't find the answer to. So YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, or check me out on my website.
I will link all of them below in the description of this video. And I urge you all again, if you are going to check out Mr. Stephen Aryan, I urge you all to check out these two books. These are incredible. And leave reviews, leave feedback, because at the end of the day, reviews are what help push the book. Those are the biggest things that really help not only motivate us as authors to see people loving our works, but also generates more discussion in the publishing world. So I will link all those down below in the description of this video. And again, I want to thank our guest, Mr. Stephen Aryan, for joining us today and providing insight into the traditionally publishing world. So, Stephen, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And with that, listeners, this concludes this amazing interview. I hope you've enjoyed all these incredible guests I've had for the month of April. And until next time, this has been The Wandering Scribe and The Wandering Quill signing out, and we'll see you again in May.